Welcome to Class Matters, the podcast where we ask the question, what would our country look like if it were governed by and for the working class? In episode 2, Mark Dimondstein, president of the American Postal Workers Union, talks with Adolph Reed Jr. about the importance of a public postal service, our country's move toward authoritarianism, and the need for independent working class politics. You're listening to Class Matters, the podcast. Class Matters is a project of the Debs Jones Douglas Institute, which works to promote a government and an economy that works for working people. I'm Catherine Isaac, Executive Director. Let's get started with introductions. Mark Dimondstein is a postal worker from Greensboro, North Carolina, who has served as president of the American Postal Workers Union since 2013. The APWU represents more than 200,000 USPS employees and retirees, and nearly 2,000 private sector mail workers. Under Dimondstein's leadership, the APWU has made significant gains in bargaining for better wages and working conditions, established a grand alliance to save our public postal service, strengthened the unity among the 4 postal unions, helped forge the campaign for postal banking, and led the successful fight against a privatization scheme involving the office supply chain Staples. Dimondstein has led the union through 2 years of pandemic challenges and the contentious 2020 presidential election. Adolph Reed Jr. has been involved in working class politics for more than half a century. He is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. His research interests include American and Afro-American politics and political thought, urban politics, and American political development. Welcome to both of you, President Dimondstein and Adolph Reed.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Yep, same here. Absolutely.
So, President Dimondstein, let's start by getting your thoughts on the Biden administration's announcement of a program to send free COVID tests to households via the Postal Service. Is this a good example of why it's so vital to maintain the public infrastructure of the Postal Service?
Absolutely. I think it's a great example. Here we have this terrible pandemic, 2 years, not going away, unfortunately, anytime soon. It's a tremendous public health crisis. And so we support the initiative, getting test kits into people's homes so people can better protect themselves. If they're going to gather for holidays, for weddings, whatever, they have the test kits. If they're not feeling well at the moment, they can test and protect their families, their loved one, their coworkers. And the beautiful thing that underscores how invaluable the post office is for this kind of thing, the public post office, is there's no other entity that can and has to go to every single address, no matter who we are and where we live. That's the wonderful thing about the public institution and its universal service. So the private companies, UPS, FedEx, DHL, whatever, they're going to go wherever they can make money. Post office is going to go to everybody. So here's another example. There's equal access for the people of the country to something that so deeply affects their health and safety and well-being. So I think it's a wonderful example. And I can vouch that postal workers are ready to rock and roll.
That's great. Adolph?
Well, no, I can't say anything except to agree with that. I mean, it's absolutely the case. And it's another basic fact that underscores the importance of public goods and public services in this country.
Right.
So the pandemic has brought attention and appreciation to the public postal service, and it's underscored its vital role in our economy and our democracy. Can you walk us through, President Dimondstein, the challenges that you and your members have faced over the past 2 years?
Well, I think we have faced similar challenges to so many other, quotes, essential workers. And of course, workers are always essential because we make the world go around. But whether we were grocery store workers, sanitation workers, firefighters, postal workers, meat packers, farm workers, truck drivers, and of course, our wonderful medical personnel during this trying time, it has been a lot of stress and strain on postal workers. We've had a lot of workers sicken. We've lost over 300 postal workers. But there's also a lot of the stress of coming to work, still carrying out our mission to the people of the country, dedicated to that, but also want to make sure we're not bringing disease home to our family. A lot of postal workers, like everybody, we have people in our families that are facing sometimes some underlying health conditions. We have young people in many of our families. We have older people in our families. So there's definitely been a lot of stress and strain. We've done very well as a union to try to protect the workforce, make it as safe as possible, but there's no perfect solution. And it's also affected service. And that gets at the heart of postal workers too, because we really want the people of the country to get the best of service at all times. We've had moments, including one now, we have 17, 18,000 postal workers a day who are quarantined, many more who are out sick, have been exposed and are not coming to work because they don't want to expose others. So it has affected the service as well. So many challenges, and those challenges are going to continue. But I think you mentioned, Catherine, that I think the people of the country do appreciate it. But at the same time, the people still expect and need the prompt, reliable, and efficient services that they're promised under the law.
And talk about why the prompt and efficient services were compromised during this time with Postmaster DeJoys' slowdown of the mail.
Well, yeah, there were many factors. Some of it was that, some of it's historical, going back to some laws that were passed that drained funds out of the Postal Service. We'll probably have a chance to talk about that later in the podcast. But the Postal Service was already deeply understaffed before Louis DeJoy, as the new PMG, got there. And he made matters worse by putting in some policies that slowed down the mail. But when you add in the impact of the pandemic on staff and the need to stay safe, keep people safe, work together as workers to keep each other safe, it just exacerbated an already stressed and strained system to the point that we couldn't produce for the people of the country. And not this last holiday season in 2021, but in 2020, the system just about collapsed. Again, I think the people of the country are very patient. I think they understand it. I think they definitely appreciate and trust the Postal Service. But at the end of the day, again, the people got to get their medicines. They have to deal with their needed correspondence. They have to get their e-commerce. And I guess that's the flip side of what I'm talking about, is the pandemic also, I think, brought a new appreciation, an ever deeper appreciation for our postal workers and the Postal Service, because we were able to keep the people so connected, which is our mission during this time.
But even with all of those obstacles, postal workers rallied during the election process to get the ballots delivered. And Americans came out in support in the thousands, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, it wasn't just postal workers. The people of the country in the summer of 2020, in the face of some of the postal management policies that was slowing down the mail and really questioning whether the Postal Service would be there to deliver the election mail for the people of the country during a pandemic when tens of millions of people could not get to the ballot box safely in any other way. So we were part of that movement, but it was really a movement amongst the people of the country. It was almost a popular uprising demanding that the post office do right. And based on that popular response, postal management was compelled to do the right thing. We worked very closely with them, as did the other postal unions. And we were able to deliver to the ballot box approximately 65 million ballots. Otherwise, people that may not have had that access to the ballot box, and it's actually about 130 million when you consider that the ballots have to be mailed to the voter first and then come back. And somewhere in the 99.7% range, those ballots were delivered, quote, on time. And even if they were a day late, it doesn't mean they didn't count, because it was still delivered long before the ballots were due to be counted. And we actually the unions instituted, it was our idea, but management had to do it as well. We had local, what we called labor management task forces that were focused on making sure that those ballots got through the system. And I think it's important for the listeners to understand, it was not a partisan effort. It was not about electing this one or that one. It was about serving the people of the country with our civic responsibility to help enable the people to exercise their cherished and hard-fought right to vote. So it was a wonderful example of what the public post office can and should and does mean to the people of the country.
Yeah, totally. And I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but that's yet a very concrete and recent and immediate factor that underscores the importance of having a public postal service, but also the importance of having a unionized workforce, because the union is part of the public charge too, and part of the union's charge is to pursue the public charge, right? So, right. And we can't make it without it.
So you talked about some of the slowdowns during the previous 2 years, but the attacks on the Postal Service predate the pandemic, of course. And aren't those attacks really just an effort to privatize this public service? Can you tell our listeners in particular about the 4Ds on the path to privatization?
Sure. Let me just start by saying we have found, and sometimes even in our own ranks, that the concept of privatization is not always readily understood, but it's pretty simple. It means turning over the public assets, the public monies, the public commons, the public good to private corporations for their own individual private gain, whether it's their own CEOs, their shareholders, Wall Street, and whatever. But because those who do want to privatize and get their hands on that money throw the term around a lot, they make it seem like it's a positive thing when it's the exact opposite. So the 4Ds go something like this. In order to privatize the public services, and not just postal services, we've seen this happen with public education, for example. They have to implement, the privatizers, the Wall Street financial world, they have to put 4 things in place first. First, they have to defund. That's the first D. So you've seen that with public education. You've seen that with other public services. And in 2006, Congress, on a bipartisan basis, passed the Postal Accountability Enhancement Act that forced the post office to fund retiree health care benefits, not retirement benefits, retiree health care benefits 75 years into the future for people that didn't even work at the post office, Catherine, and in some cases weren't even born yet. That took $5.5 billion a year out of the postal system. And the postal system under its current structure does not run on taxpayer money. It runs on postal revenue. So it took all that money out of the system that could have been used for buildings, for staffing, for equipment, for new vehicles, for environmentally friendly vehicles. So it really defunded the post office. And behind that, there was a lot of the next D, which is then you have to degrade the services. So behind the defunding, you slow down the mail. You close post offices, you reduce hours, you cut staffing, and all of that degrades the service. So then once you degrade the service, people lose confidence in the public commons. And then it leads to what Adolph just touched on a little bit, the demonization of the workers and the institution. They don't know what they're doing. They can't get it right. They make too much money, whatever it is. So then when you have those 3 things in place, those 3 Ds, they can move to their 4th D and destroy the public institution with the idea that the private sector is so much more efficient, they can do it better, blah, 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 as to quote Greta Thunberg. But when I raise these 4Ds sometimes, one of our executive board members at the American Postal Workers Union said, Mark, you're leaving out the 5th D. And he said, what's that? He said, we can unite with the people of the country and defend the public post office and win. So it's always important to also talk about the 5th D. But that path to privatization is very similar to any of the public entities that these Wall Street fat cats and these corporate fat cats want to get their money on. And it's about, that old saying or the movie, follow the money. That's what privatization is about. Post office takes in over $70 billion a year of revenue. It's a lot of money. And the privatizers want their hands on that for their own private gain.
Yeah, man, that's so true. I mean, I remember my first experience of privatization up close and personal was when I worked in city government. And people were always talking about how privatization brings efficiency, privatization brings efficiency. And after a little while, I was genuinely surprised to learn that most of the public outsourcing or privatizing contracts come with guarantees of profit rates, right? So it's not like they're getting, the efficiency of the market, whatever that's supposed to be. Like the whole point is to transfer profits, right, as you say, like the corporations, and the way that they extract profit is the same way they've always extracted profit, by driving down wages and with tax on workers' rights. So it's as old as the hills, but they've got this way of sort of packaging it, and I'll take a shot at Wharton because that's my old institution. But what people at those places do is provide the rationales to make this old thing, right, look like it's something new and shiny that they then try to sell to people.
I couldn't agree with you more. And privatization always actually reduces service,
right,
raises the cost of service,
right,
socks it to the workers who perform the service, but always increases the profits of the privatizers as they laugh all the way to the bank.
And for corporations in Wall Street, is a side benefit of privatization also getting rid of unions?
Well, yes, the public sector is better organized in this moment of history than the private sector. So anytime you can come at an entity like the Postal Service that has over 500,000 unionized workers, that kind of unionization that led to a safer condition for the workers, for example, and really the postal customers during this, while we're still in this pandemic as well. Yeah.
And in fact, at this point, I mean, I'm concerned that there are political forces at play across the ideological spectrum, basically, that are committed to putting together political alliances that exclude the labor movement, right? Finding other ways to define who people are, right? That separate them from their working lives, basically. And this is I know we'll probably talk about this some more, but one of the things I think that's so insidious about this notion that there's no working class in America, there's only this big amorphous middle class that has Marx members and like all of us who belong to the same class as like a multi-million-dollar a year brain surgeon or an investment banker. And it's part of the bill of the goods that bipartisan neoliberalism has been trying to sell the American people for 50 years now. And part of the challenge for us is to reassert that, no, actually, there is a working class and we're in it.
It's interesting you raise that, Adolph, because I sit on the AFL-CIO Executive Council, and more often than not in most meetings, I have to make that exact point when people keep talking about, these are labor leaders talking about the middle class, as if our goal is labor movement is to get people to leave the working class rather than struggle to make life what it should be within the working class and be proud of what we are and what we do.
Well said. So let's talk a little bit now about what needs to happen to right the ship and address the long-term stability of the Postal Service.
Well, there's a lot of different angles on that, Catherine. I think obviously the focus on service, it's not a business, it's a service. And those are two very different things. So that real focus on service, there's some legislative things that would be helpful to be done, such as doing away with this pre-funding mandate for the retiree health benefits. We have some prospects for that around the corner. We hope we can bring that over the finish line. But I think a lot of it is in the realm of expanded services in the post office, new creative ways of binding the country together, which is our mission, of serving people in a time when the world's changing. And Catherine, you and I worked on a lot of these things together. For example, the whole question of expanded financial services through the post office on the way to postal banking, a public option for financial services. So people have an option besides this predatory payday lending, check cashing industry that so many hard working class folks get stuck in, where they could come to the post office and for a fair price without being gouged, take care of some of their basic finances. Huge social problem. And here we have this wonderful infrastructure that belongs to the people of the country, that's trusted by and supported by 90% of the people of the country across the political spectrum. That's right there in just about every community. There are things like that. So the whole question of the environment and the question of the transition to EV transportation. Well, think about what the post office could be if it was part of the grid that enabled people to charge cars while they were traveling. And in front of every post office where you had the room, you had charging stations. Come in, people could plug in, take care of their postal business, go buy a cup of coffee, come back and hop in their car and go. So there's many, many, many things. And on the financial side, some basic check cashing of paychecks, money transfers, any kind of remittances, bill paying, all of that can be done through the post office. It was in this country. Most people don't know this. We had a postal savings bank between 1911 and 1966 or 67. And most of the posts around the world provide some kind of banking services to the postal customers. So a lot of our future does lie on that idea of capturing all of these new ways that the public entity can serve the people. The resistance to that is those private corporations that are making money off of those services and don't want the public option, as we call it. So there are many things. Now, one answer, we may have to look broader on how to fund the post office going forward. It is a time of the internet. People's habits change. Less people are mailing letters, but more people are ordering online and getting packages. So We have a saying in our world, the internet taketh and the internet giveth. But as it changes, we also have to be able to serve the people in those new ways as well.
Well, I think you just answered the next question that I had. You know, the tagline for our podcast is, what would our country look like if it were run by and for the working class? And I think you just described what the Postal Service would look like if our country were run by and for the working class. Let's go to Adolph.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Expanded public sector employment is like the most important thing we can do to attack economic inequality. And we've seen this since the beginning of the New Deal, since the post-World War II era, when it's not just expanded public sector employment, but also public sector union employment that help to lift and to stabilize what working people's incomes and their working conditions. And like even in industries that are, kind of understood to be, not especially high wage industries like the casino industry. It's unionization that's made it possible for people to buy houses, to send their kids to college, but definitely public sector employment has been increasingly, or has been very important. I mean, I remember, when I was in my 20s, one of the fallbacks that I had when I was in graduate school even was I thought, okay, well, if this doesn't work out, if I don't want to do it, then I might be able to get a job at the post office and have a decent life and have a house and have a kid and send the kid to college or whatever. And in fact, I was just talking, Mark, a couple of months ago to one of your members in my town here in Narberth, Pennsylvania, who, when we were chatting back and forth about the impact that the Staples fight had on him and his brothers and sisters. And he made the point, he said, yeah, he's a guy a little younger than I am. He said, like, I bought a house, I raised my kids, sent them to college, right? I mean, this has been a good job for me. And that's been the role of public sector employment for more than half a century. And I think it's one of the most important ways that we can attack economic inequality. And that's crucial. And that's for everybody. That's across the board, right? And that's another reason for us to have good public services. I mean, I'll say one more thing about this, that I know there's a lot of, naysaying, again, from like smart people, right, about, what we can afford to do and what we can't afford to do. But one issue from the 2016 and 2020 presidential primaries is close to my heart is free public higher education, right, for everybody. And one of the responses that came from the naysayers about that was, well, it's not practical, we can't afford it. A lot of people don't finish degrees, whatever that means. Not like education isn't just a degree. That's just a backward way of approaching trying to figure out what social policy ought to look like. And what we need to do is to figure out what we want. And this goes back to our question of what the country would look like. Figure out what we want, and then we can figure out how to pay for it. And it seems to me that that's the fundamental shift that has to happen in national political discussion now, the shift away from thinking of cost as a constraint when it comes to things that people need, but it's never a constraint. Like when we think about, the Great Recession, the sums of money that the financial sector came up with to bail out one another, basically, were like sums that I could never even imagine, and most of us couldn't imagine existing. And like overnight, hundreds of trillions of dollars could like go to bail out, some investment house. Well, the resources are there. And what it comes down to is priorities, like who's got the wheel of the bus. And the big challenge for us now is to figure out ways to work toward getting the working class to get his hands on those wheels.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good point, Adolph. I thought that was maybe the biggest contribution of the Sanders campaign. Not just him individually, but the campaign was uplifting the aspirations of workers, that we deserve more and it can be done, and let's do it. And just a quick personal story. When people say, like, how do you pay for free higher ed? My mother went to college for free in New York City.
Yeah.
So don't tell me and everybody like us who lived through that, our families, that it can't be done. It's a question of whether we're going to tax the wealthy. It's a question of whether we're going to have 800 overseas bases around the world. That's where the money is. There's plenty of money. You're 100% right. And to find what we want and then demand that it be done, I think is the right order.
So I want to go back to the role of the public postal service in our democracy. You spoke about the importance of the postal service in delivering ballots during the 2020 presidential election. So the post office, which is older than our country itself and enshrined in the Constitution, was created to serve the public good. It consistently ranks as the most popular government agency, including among millennials and Gen Z. So why do you think it's so vital to keep it public? What's at stake for our democracy, for our economy, and for our communities?
Well, on the democracy side, we look at the Postal Service as a small d democratic right of the people with equal access, universal service to everybody, no matter who we are, where we live, at reasonable, uniform prices. And by the way, the Postal Service, being the public sector, keeps everybody's rates on the package side lower, so it enables all of us to participate better in the e-commerce revolution and so on. But the Postal Service has had, as part of its democratic role in the life of the people, the exchange of ideas, the exchange of information, periodicals, all sorts of things that go along with the democratic rights of the people. The question of access to the ballot box, Catherine, that actually goes all the way back to the Civil War, where vote by mail was instituted then. But you talk about importance to democratic right to vote, as distorted as it's been, as hard fought as we have to continue to fight for it as we are now. Increases participation, gives people access to the ballot box, fraudulent free. That's all part of the big lie that somehow vote by mail leads to fraud, rigged elections, and so on. And then, of course, if e-commerce is going to work for everybody and not just for the people that have more money, you have to have that institution that reaches everybody and that belongs to everybody. Adolph touched on the jobs question. Those are issues of labor rights, human rights, democratic rights. Somebody that comes to work for the post office, you're going to get equal pay if you're male or female. You're going to get equal pay if you're Black, white, or Latino. You're going to get equal pay if you're older or younger. So it brings people together, and certainly a right to a good living wage job is an important right as well. So it brings a democracy to our community in terms of jobs and in terms of service. And if we lose that, it's just that dog-eat-dog race to the bottom that the United States government and Wall Street represents now. So it's very important to hang on to, not just to hang on to and defend, but to expand.
You both have written and spoken recently. Adolph, you wrote an article that got a lot of attention, warning of the imminent danger of an authoritarian coup in the United States. And Mark, in 2017, on behalf of the APWU members, you introduced a resolution at the AFL-CIO convention to condemn rising fascism and to fight for working class unity. And on the one-year anniversary of the January 6th coup attempt, you warned that the big lie of election fraud continues to drive our country toward authoritarian and fascist rule. How seriously do each of you find this threat? Now, let's start with you, Adolph.
I think it's really serious. I'm not quite as distraught about it now as I was a couple of months ago, but like that's no solace, because now I'm just thinking they're going to wait till 2022. And I wasn't convinced of that right a couple of months ago. Like we've gotten to a point where, I've often said lately that it's like we've come to a T intersection, and there's one right down the street from my apartment that I pass on my walk every day. So it's in my mind. And like you get to it, and we've gotten to a point where bipartisan neoliberalism, after 40 to 50 years of taking more and more away from working people, seems to have gotten to the point, not just here, but in many other places in the world, of not being able any longer to deliver enough security and benefits to enough of the population to justify its legitimacy as a nominally democratic system. So what happens then? Well, there's only two possibilities at the T intersection. You either go in one direction, and that's authoritarianism, right? Or you go in another direction, which is to figure out or to reorient government and political debate in ways that begin to pay more attention to making the lives of working people better. And there are even some elements within the ruling class or economists who 20 years ago would have denied this, now are saying, well, actually, like one of the problems that we have is that these financial crises are going to be chronic, and we need to do something, right, to lubricate the system to try to at least give the appearance of making things somewhat better for the working class. But I think that we've gotten to a point now where we either go in one direction or the other. And as I said, it's not just the US. You can look at India, Hungary, Poland, Ukraine, Brazil now, like with Bolsonaro, like the coup in Bolivia, the recent election in Chile. And I would add Boris Johnson in the UK, right? There's a rise of a global tendency toward authoritarianism. And I think, frankly, that the only way for us to counter it in the US is to focus on a politics that's directly addressed to working people, to the working class, as the basic solidarity that all of us share, but with the basic condition of having to work for a living and like everything that follows from that, that's shared most broadly in the society. And if we don't start to build that kind of politics, then I'm afraid it's going to be almost impossible for us to hold the tide against those dangerous forces out there. But Mark, I'll pass it to you.
Well, obviously, it's a huge issue. I probably have a little different view than you, Adolph. I have probably less solace now, a year later, knowing what I know now and some of the things that have come to light, and the way that the big lie is holding firm.
Right.
So that a year later, despite court cases, despite all the evidence, despite all the facts, somehow more people believe now than a year ago that the election was rigged and stolen. And what's that leading to? So I'll go back to my family history a little bit, Catherine, if I can. So I talked about my mother. Now I'll talk about my father. World War II, Army Air Force, highly decorated veteran, bombing fascist Italy. I was raised differently than most people in my generation. We were told Nazi Germany can never happen in the United States. My father raised me saying that if we're not ever vigilant, it can happen here because it's not based on one mad man.
Right.
So I'm fortunate in that sense that I have that insight and that understanding that was passed on. But it's a huge danger. It's a huge threat to the working class. Our only way forward as a working class to succeed, whether it's Medicare for all, whether it's living wages, whether it's safe jobs, whether we have a planet we can sustain life on, comes down to our unity. Fascism is the exact opposite. Divide us up, blame somebody that doesn't look like us, blame an immigrant, blame somebody that speaks a different language, blame somebody from another state or another tradition, whatever it is. And that's what's going to destroy the working class movement. When Hitler took power in 1933, and by the way, all the listeners should never forget this, or if you don't know it, learn it. He came to power completely legally. 1933 takes power early in the year. Big May Day demonstration in 1933, Day of the International Working Class. We love the working class. 2 days later, what did they do? They destroyed all the unions, declared them illegal, and jailed, persecuted, and often killed people like the listeners who are listening to this podcast. That's what authoritarianism and fascism means to the labor movement and the working class. And the working class of the world, led by, under the heel, the torturous and deadly heel of Nazism, tens of millions of people, 30 million Soviet people, our ally in World War II, died at the hands of the fascists. All my family in France died at the hands of the fascists. All over. My mother's cousin was a unionized worker in a Renault plant, and he was one of the first people taken and sent to concentration camps under the heels of Nazism. This is what it does to the working class movement and to the union movement. So it's a huge threat. And January 6th was a dress rehearsal. Beware if we don't get our act together. And we're not going to get our act together unless we can address as a movement the deep injuries and concerns of the working class and answer those together. Otherwise, we're going to be susceptible to the demagoguery. That's what Hitler did. He played in the deep injuries of the German working class and the German people, and then used it to destroy the working class, not only of Germany, but wherever he could in the world. I do think right now the defense of voting rights and the effort to expand voting rights is a key intersection with how we're going to fight the drive towards authoritarianism and fascism. So I really think we have to have tremendous emphasis on this.
Yeah, I was just going to ask one practical question, which is, on the voting rights front, what the hell can they do now?
Well, I think, it's a longer run battle now, but I think it comes down to whether Congress builds movements or movements move Congress. We don't have enough of a movement yet to move Congress. But people act like you can never move these people. Well, how the hell did we get civil rights legislation?
Right, exactly.
Or labor rights.
So let's talk about how to move forward. And first, let's go all the way back to the 1990s. The three of us worked together with many others to create an independent political voice for the working class. That effort to create a labor party attempted to find a way out of the lesser of two evils choices that were continually offered. Given the lay of the land now, what should the labor movement be doing? Where should its focus and resources be directed?
Adolph, you want to take that first, or you want me to?
Yeah, well, I'll start just to make a couple of comments, right? Because this could keep us going for a long time. But this point that we've come to now that we were just talking about, with respect to the danger of authoritarianism or fascism, was already present in what we were trying to do then, right? I mean, I remember our founding brother, Tony Mazzocchi, said very passionately that bipartisan neoliberalism, as we call it now, wasn't working for working people. They weren't getting anything, falling farther and farther behind. And that if we, people connected with the politics of the working class, couldn't find credible alternatives, a credible explanation of why peoples are suffering the way they're suffering, and couldn't provide plausible routes to try to change it, then there are other much more dangerous tendencies out there that would take the day. And the point there is that we need a politics that addresses the real and the material concerns of the working class. And I think that's what we all understood, right? All of us who came together right around the Labor Party experiment did. And that's still the charge for us. Mark, I'll give it to you.
Look, in terms of what the labor movement should be doing or can be doing, I think fundamentally, the organized labor movement needs to break with the Democratic Party. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't good congressional representatives that share many of the concerns we do on this podcast and are firmly on the side of the working folks and the oppressed. But the Democratic Party as an institution, as an entity, is not a party of the working class. It's a party of Wall Street. Adolph, you reminded me under Brother Mazzocchi's leadership, I think our slogan was, correct me if I'm wrong, the bosses have two parties, we need one of our own.
Right.
Some people took it further and say the bosses have one party because those two are the same, and we need one of our own. Mm-hmm. But the labor movement needs to base ourselves on independent politics. I would love to see the labor movement get more involved in helping to build what we tried to do and worked on in the 1990s. That task is still before us. An independent, labor-based political party that's accountable to the working class and the oppressed of this country. But one thing we can do, even as the labor movement as it exists, is we can even approach elections based on issues rather than individual candidates. So what we see around our elections is in many cases, the most anti-union representatives can get elected based on hot button issues, whatever they may be. And at the very same time, those very same voters are voting up and in favor of pro-working class referenda on living wages, for example. But if we don't build an alternative, and I think you were touching on this, Ada, the working class of the country is done with business as usual with these two political parties. And if we as a labor movement don't help provide the alternative to an independent labor-based political party, then the demagogues, the Trumps and the Bannons of the world are going to move in because people are desperate for a different path for answers. And the working class is right to be done with these parties. We've been going Tweedledum, Tweedledee back and forth for decades and decades and decades. And we don't have much to show for it, do we? So we're going to have to help build that alternative. And building that alternative is part of the answer. And you were touching on this. It's part of the answer to make sure that this country doesn't go down this authoritarian / fascist path. I think that the labor movement has to get much more aggressive about organizing, bringing people into unions, building the unity of the working class in that process around common interests and common concerns. Amazon is before us. It's changing the way the whole world works. What are we going to do? RWDSU, to their credit, took a first step. The workers, more importantly, to their credit, took a first courageous step in Bessemer, Alabama. But if we're going to organize Amazon, it's going to have to be a crusade of all of us. Right. But those kind of things and building some working class power, even when the corporations have the power, but within that, building some real solid working class power is also part of the way out of the challenges that we find ourselves in now.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. Let's wrap this up with any final thoughts. Adolph, you want to go first?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that, I would underscore everything that we've all said, Mark especially. The one little thing, right, to think about, and this also reaches back to the first episode, is that we could maybe also experiment with finding ways to run candidate elections that are, in fact, ballot initiative kind of elections. And that takes some discipline, right? Because that takes having candidates who are not aspirational as office holders, but who see themselves as embodiments of the issue campaign. But, that's just a wrinkle on the same thing. But yeah, I think that's the only way forward for us. And look, things are ugly and they're going to get uglier if we can't start to tackle this nut.
I certainly agree with that point, Adolph. Catherine, I'll just say this. Maybe it's a little of a general point to some of the specific things we've been talking about. I think the pandemic is put before the working class and the people of this country. The opportunity, because I think in crisis, even tragic crisis, there's also those seeds of opportunity and hope. It's given us the opportunity to reevaluate what kind of society and country we want to live in. Don't we want a country where everybody has paid sick leave and therefore we're all safer? Don't we want a voice at work where everybody, when during this pandemic, can do the kind of things that the American Postal Workers Union and other unions have done in relation to the company to keep workers as safe as possible? Doesn't everybody need health care? What happened in this pandemic was criminal because there's no collective responsibility or vehicle for delivering health care. So it gives us an opportunity to kind of, people talk about we want to get back to the new normal or the normal. Well, in terms of the pandemic, yes, but in terms of the country we live in, no. Let's fix the problems we have and use the lessons of the pandemic. And since we talked a lot about the Postal Service, in some ways, I'd like the whole country to be the Postal Service for the well-being of everybody, the public good, good union jobs, good living wage jobs, and let's just leave the profit out of it and rise as a people, and in particular within the people to rise as a working class. But listen, I've enjoyed it. I really thank you for having me on. And doesn't mean we're done, but that's all I got to say for now.
Thank you. Excellent
That's
way
great,
to
brother. Thanks a lot.
excellent way to end this episode. So thank you, President Dimondstein and Adolph Reed, for this important discussion. You've been listening to Class Matters podcast. You can subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and you can support us on Patreon. Our editor is Jimmy Wirt. Thank you for listening to Class Matters.